Helena Carrington decided to spend one day pretending to be poor, certain that a single afternoon of discomfort could prove she understood the lives of people she had never truly met. Within 2 hours the money was gone, her phone had locked itself against her, and the security team meant to shadow her had simply vanished from the street corner where they were supposed to wait. At a windswept bus station on the far side of Chicago, she met Wade Hollis, a single father who had lost his job days earlier because of a decision that carried her own signature. Wade had exactly $20 left for his dinner and his bus fare to an appeal hearing that could restore his career, and he handed every last bill to a shivering stranger without asking her name twice. Helena took the money, thanked him, and only later, staring at a folded termination letter sticking out of his jacket pocket, did she understand whose company had thrown him away. Before she found out whose life that $20 would actually save, tap subscribe so you do not miss where this story goes next, because nothing about the next hour unfolds the way either of them expects. The trouble began 3 weeks earlier in a boardroom on the 41st floor of Carrington Tower, where an assistant slid a tablet across the table and asked Helena to look at a video that had already been viewed several million times overnight. In the clip, taken from a charity panel months before, Helena said that a hard day could not defeat a person who knew how to manage their choices, and the internet had decided that sentence belonged to a woman who had never once worried about rent. Public reaction accused her of never understanding what it meant to lose a job, of never knowing that a missed bus could cost someone an entire day's wages, of writing policy from the top floor without ever meeting the people who lived beneath it. Analysts pointed out that the very cost-cutting program she championed had eliminated positions by the thousand, while the company's savings figures kept climbing on every quarterly report. Dorian Blackwell, the company's chief operating officer, watched the fallout with the calm of a man who had already decided how to use it, and within a day he walked into Helena's office with a proposal wrapped in the language of redemption. He suggested that Helena spend 24 hours living as an unemployed woman with nothing but $40, no credit cards, no recognizable phone, and no driver waiting outside to soften the edges of the experiment. She would wear clothing from a second-hand shop, find her own meals, and try to secure temporary work using nothing but her wits, all while a quiet security detail trailed her from a distance in case anything went wrong. Dorian framed it as an act of humility that would silence her critics and hand the company a genuine story of a leader willing to feel what her employees felt every day. Paige Sutter, her chief of staff, thought the timeline felt rushed and said so twice, but Helena's pride had already fastened onto the idea, and she believed she was clever enough to turn one difficult day into a policy that would actually help people. She pictured herself returning triumphant with new insight, a new employee assistance program, and a story that would finally quiet the noise, following her name across every headline. On the morning the experiment began, a car dropped Helena at the edge of a neighborhood far from her usual routes, and she stepped out wearing a worn coat, plain shoes, and an envelope containing $40 folded into her palm. Before the car pulled away, Dorian sent a short message to her temporary phone that read simply that by midnight she would learn ordinary people were stronger than she assumed, a line she took for encouragement rather than the quiet insult it actually was. She walked 3 blocks feeling almost giddy with the novelty of anonymity, imagining she could handle whatever the day threw at her because she had always handled everything thrown at her before. 10 minutes later, reaching into her coat pocket out of habit, she discovered the envelope was empty, the $40 gone as though it had never existed at all. For a moment she assumed this was simply part of the test, a wrinkle designed to sharpen her instincts, and she told herself calmly that a woman who ran a company this size could certainly improvise her way through losing $40. Helena reached for her emergency phone, expecting to call Paige and laugh about the missing envelope, only to find the device rejecting every password she tried until it locked itself completely. She searched for the unmarked security vehicle that was supposed to be parked along the corner exactly as planned, but the street held nothing except a line of empty meters and a bakery closing its shutters for the afternoon. Still convinced this was a deliberate part of the exercise meant to force her into self-reliance, she walked into a support center downtown and asked to use a phone, only to be told firmly that she needed identification before anyone could help her. A diner nearby refused to let her touch their phone unless she bought something first, and since she had no money at all, she stood outside the glass door, feeling the cold seep into her borrowed coat. A bus rolled past without stopping because her transit application lived on a phone that no longer recognized her fingerprint, and a temporary staffing office turned her away within minutes because she could not provide a fixed address. A woman behind the staffing counter did not even look up from her paperwork as she explained the policy, repeating the same sentence twice as though Helena might simply be slow to understand rather than genuinely stranded. Helena tried explaining that she had run a company larger than the one advertising open shifts on the board behind the counter, but the words sounded absurd the moment they left her mouth, dressed as she was in a borrowed coat with dirt already creeping up the hem. She began to notice how differently people spoke to her now, how eye contact shortened, how doors that once opened automatically for her now required an explanation she could not adequately give. A librarian let her sit near an outlet for 20 minutes, before politely asking her to move along since the seat was needed for someone with a library card, and Helena realized she did not have identification of any kind to offer in return. Each closed door reminded her of the last in a pattern she had never experienced before, one where the absence of an address blocked her from work, the absence of money blocked her from transportation, and the absence of transportation blocked her from anywhere she might have found either. When she finally reached Carrington's own customer support line, hoping to quietly flag an emergency without breaking her cover, she sat on hold for nearly 40 minutes before the call disconnected without explanation. By late afternoon, hungry and thoroughly cold, she found herself standing beneath a bus shelter with peeling paint, watching her own breath fog in front of her while commuters hurried past without a second glance. A man in a faded work jacket noticed her standing there far longer than anyone waiting for a bus normally would, and he crossed the platform to ask if she needed to call someone. That man was Wade Hollis, and his simple question would become the only kind gesture Helena Carrington received all day. Helena told him she had lost her wallet, that her phone had locked itself, and that she had no way home, all of which was true even if she left out exactly who she was. She introduced herself only as Helen Carter, a woman recently let go from her job, and Wade did not press for more than that, the way people rarely do when they recognize the particular exhaustion on another person's face. He checked the posted schedule and told her the last bus toward downtown would leave in about 15 minutes. And that the fare plus a small meal would come close to $20 altogether. Without hesitation, he reached into his own wallet and pulled out the only bill inside, a crumpled 20 that had clearly been folded and unfolded many times that day already. He pressed it into her hand before she could think of a polite way to refuse, and Helena had no idea yet that this single bill represented every last cent Wade Hollis had left in the world. She tried to hand the money back immediately, insisting she could not possibly take it, but Wade simply said she could return it once things settled down for her, as though repayment were a formality rather than a certainty. When she asked how he intended to get home without any cash of his own, he glanced down at his boots and said quietly that he still had those, meaning he was prepared to walk if it came to that. Helena studied his wallet as he closed it and saw no other bills hiding inside, nothing folded behind a receipt, Nothing that suggested this sacrifice cost him less than it appeared to. She asked, almost without meaning to, why a stranger would give away his last $20 to a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes. Wade answered that there had once been a day when he needed someone to believe his word before demanding proof of it, and he had never forgotten how rare that kindness turned out to be. She accepted the bill, but did not immediately board the bus, her attention caught by an envelope tucked halfway into his coat, stamped with the unmistakable logo of Carrington Metro Properties. Visible along the top edge were the words "Notice of Termination," printed in the same format Helena had signed off on countless times without ever reading the individual names attached. She asked carefully whether he had worked for Carrington, and Wade explained that he had spent years as a maintenance supervisor at one of the company's residential buildings before losing that job entirely. He had been dismissed after refusing to sign a report, certifying that a heating system had been fully repaired when he knew several critical components remained unreplaced, a decision he would not reverse, no matter how much pressure came from above. His district manager had pushed him to sign anyway because the quarterly budget had already been cut, and when Wade continued to object, his personnel file was quietly rewritten to describe him as uncooperative and resistant to direction. Helena felt something cold settle in her stomach as she recognized her own digital signature beneath the termination order Wade unfolded, a signature attached automatically to thousands of similar decisions she had never personally reviewed. She had never read his file, never seen his name, never known that a single approval generated by an automated system could end a career built over many careful years. Wade did not know yet that the woman beside him bore any responsibility for what had happened to him, and he said simply that perhaps the person at the top had never actually seen his name at all. That sentence landed harder on Helena than any accusation could have, because it was not spoken with anger, only with the tired resignation of a man who had stopped expecting otherwise. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the $20 he had just given away was meant to carry him to an appeal hearing scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon, a hearing that would automatically close his case if he failed to appear. He spoke about it without drama, the way a man speaks about a weather forecast he cannot change, and Helena found herself unsettled by how ordinary he made the loss sound. Wade mentioned that he had already sold a set of tools he had owned since his 20s, just to cover the previous month's rent, and that his son had started picking up small jobs after school without being asked, quietly trying to help in ways a 17-year-old should never have to consider. He did not say any of this for sympathy. He said it the way a person recites facts they have simply had to accept, facts that no longer carried the sting they once did. Helena had spent years reading quarterly reports filled with numbers describing exactly this kind of hardship, yet none of those spreadsheets had ever made her feel the cold the way standing beside Wade at that bus shelter did. Helena immediately tried pressing the bill back into his hand, horrified that her own survival might cost him the one chance he had left to reclaim his job, but Wade refused to take it back. He told her plainly that she was the one stranded right now, and that he still had a few hours left to find another way to reach that hearing on time. Helena stood there holding the crumpled bill, beginning to understand that the man who had just rescued her from a freezing evening might lose everything because he had chosen to help a stranger instead of himself. She decided, almost without deliberation, that she would not simply walk away and disappear into whatever comfort waited for her once the day officially ended. Instead, Helena told Wade she would accompany him to the hearing and repay him properly once she managed to reach someone who could confirm her identity, and together they used part of the $20 to buy 2 bus tickets bound toward downtown. It was the first time in years that Helena had ridden public transit through the neighborhoods her own company owned, watching through smudged glass as billboards bearing the Carrington name promised stability to tenants who no longer believed the slogan applied to them. She saw storefronts standing empty because rents had climbed past what small businesses could manage, saw windows covered in plastic sheeting on a building that still carried her family's logo above the entrance, and saw workers transferring between 3 separate buses just to reach jobs that paid barely enough to justify the trip. An employee support center meant to serve residents displayed hours that closed before most working people could ever visit, a detail that struck Helena as almost cruel once she noticed it from the outside rather than a printed policy document. Wade did not lecture her about any of this. He simply pointed things out as they passed, describing what he had personally witnessed rather than delivering some rehearsed condemnation of the company that had discarded him. He explained that he had filed numerous maintenance reports over the years covering heating systems, elevators, and electrical wiring that needed urgent attention, and that each report seemed to shrink or soften by the time it reached anyone with authority to approve real repairs. Around the same period, Dorian Blackwell had unveiled a cost reduction initiative called Project Clear Horizon, celebrated publicly for saving the company more than $60 million in a single fiscal year. Wade believed most of those savings came not from genuine efficiency but from postponed repairs, from replacing experienced staff with the cheapest available contractors, and from quietly reclassifying urgent safety complaints as routine maintenance that could wait indefinitely. When Helena asked why he had not simply found employment somewhere else after his dismissal, Wade admitted he had applied to several places, but each application ran into the same wall. Once employers saw his file listed a safety protocol violation, a phrase vague enough to end conversations before they began. During the ride, his phone buzzed with a brief call from his teenage son, Eli, and Wade kept his voice light, telling the boy only that he would be home a little later than expected, and reminding him to reheat the food waiting in the refrigerator. He said nothing about the missing money or the uncertainty hanging over the rest of his day, choosing instead to protect his son from a burden that belonged entirely to him. When the bus finally reached the appeal office, both of them stepped off into a gray afternoon, only to find the front doors locked despite more than an hour remaining before the posted closing time. They circled the building until they discovered a side entrance still propped open, and inside they found Marla Keene, the Regional Human Resources Director, gathering her belongings as though preparing to leave for the day. Marla recognized Wade immediately and made little effort to hide her irritation, informing him that his case had already been processed and that no further appeal was necessary. Wade produced his appointment confirmation, showing he still had time remaining, but Marla claimed the system had updated the schedule and that he had failed to confirm his slot through an email he never received. He explained that his employee account had been deactivated the moment he was terminated, which meant he had no way to receive any notification sent to an address he could no longer access, a detail Marla dismissed with a flat remark that his inability to read an email did not obligate the company to change its procedures for him. Helena stood beside him throughout the exchange, mistaken for just another unemployed woman accompanying a disgruntled former employee, since Marla had never met the actual chief executive in person. When Helena tried to ask a question about the fairness of the appeal process, Marla told her sharply that she should worry about finding her own job before offering opinions on how the company should be run. Helena swallowed the urge to reveal her identity on the spot, sensing that doing so would only produce a performance of respect rather than any honest accounting of how the system actually treated people without power. Instead, she stayed quiet and watched, absorbing every detail of how easily authority could be wielded against someone with no leverage to push back. Marla slid a document across the desk toward Wade, offering a small severance payment and a revised record describing his departure as voluntary, provided he agreed never to discuss the maintenance issues he had documented. Wade refused without hesitation, explaining that the agreement would not protect him at all. It would only protect whoever had falsified the original safety reports in the first place. Marla responded by calling security and declaring that Wade was disrupting the office, a claim that visibly startled Helena, given how calmly he had spoken throughout the entire conversation. As security approached, Helena noticed a folder on the desk labeled Project Clear Horizon, its opening page listing an unusually high savings figure attributed to what it called optimized maintenance operations. She recognized the exact number Dorian had presented at the last board meeting, yet the internal document in front of her suggested many of those costs had merely been delayed rather than genuinely eliminated. Before security could usher them out, Wade quietly slipped a small flash drive from his jacket pocket, explaining under his breath that it contained copies of the original repair orders he had saved to protect himself from exactly this kind of dispute. Helena understood in that moment that Wade was not merely a wronged employee seeking reinstatement. He was holding evidence capable of unraveling the very achievement Dorian had built his reputation upon. Outside, using coins scraped together from what remained of the $20, Helena found a payphone and finally reached Paige, whose voice cracked with relief and confusion at once. Paige explained that the security detail had received a message claiming Helena wanted her movements untracked for the remainder of the day, an order none of them had questioned, given how the whole exercise had been framed from the start. The emergency phone Helena carried had been remotely locked, using authorization from an executive account, and more troubling still, Dorian had summoned an emergency board meeting scheduled for 5 o'clock that same afternoon. At that meeting, Dorian intended to argue that Helena had gone missing during a public relations crisis of her own making, and he planned to ask the board to temporarily suspend her authority, transfer operational control to himself, approve the long-rumored sale of Carrington Metro properties, and frame her absence as a leave taken for personal and health reasons rather than the sabotage it actually was. Helena realized with a jolt that the entire poverty experiment had never been designed to teach her empathy. It had been engineered to remove her from headquarters at the precise moment a hostile transition needed her gone. Paige had already gathered some of the falsified security instructions but lacked enough evidence to prove definitively that Dorian was the one who issued them. Helena asked her to contact Audrey Vale immediately and have her examine every figure attached to Project Clear Horizon before the board meeting began. Overhearing pieces of this frantic call, Wade slowly began to understand that the woman he knew as Helen Carter was not simply another displaced worker caught in a difficult afternoon. He asked her directly who she actually was, and Helena, unable to continue the pretense any longer, admitted that her real name was Helena Carrington. Wade said nothing for a long moment, looking first at the worn coat she still wore, and then at the termination letter still folded in his own pocket, the one carrying her signature. His silence hurt Helena more than any outburst could have, because it carried the particular weight of someone recalculating everything he thought he understood about the day. Finally he spoke, telling her that for her this had only ever been a single day, while for people like him there was no car arriving at midnight to carry them back to comfort. Helena tried to explain that she had never intended for Dorian to weaponize the experiment against her, that she had trusted the plan when it was presented to her as a gesture of goodwill rather than a trap. Wade replied that whatever Dorian had done did not erase her own responsibility, since she was the one who had approved a system allowing thousands of terminations to move forward without a single human being reading the files attached to those decisions. Helena admitted, quietly and without excuse, that he was right about that much, regardless of anything else happening around them. Wade turned and began walking away, still carrying the flash drive that might be the only thing capable of saving her company from a hostile takeover engineered from within its own walls. Helena followed him, though she made a point of not framing her request around the company at all, choosing instead to ask for a chance to correct decisions that had carried her name without her true knowledge. Wade told her plainly that his concern was never about her position as chief executive. His concern belonged to the residents living in buildings that still needed real repairs, and to workers who had become expendable line items in someone else's profit report. Helena promised she would not limit her response to reinstating his job alone, vowing instead to open an independent investigation into every decision made under Project Clear Horizon from its very beginning. Wade remained skeptical, telling her he needed to see action rather than promises before any board vote determined whether those promises would even matter. They made their way to the building Wade had once supervised, only to find his access badge deactivated, leaving them stranded outside the technical areas he knew better than anyone else in the company. An elderly resident recognized him through the glass doors and let them inside without hesitation. A small moment that said more about the trust Wade had earned over the years than any personnel file ever could. Inside the maintenance room, Wade showed Helena components, labeled as replaced, that still carried the serial numbers of parts, installed many years earlier, inspection forms bearing signatures that appeared to be duplicated rather than individually signed, and invoices inflated by a contractor with ties directly back to Dorian's family. He pointed out urgent repair requests that had been quietly reclassified as routine maintenance, along with a staffing schedule showing a single technician responsible for nearly 3 times the buildings any reasonable standard would allow. Helena finally understood that Project Clear Horizon had never actually saved the company $60 million. It had merely hidden costs that would inevitably resurface later while manufacturing artificial profit designed to inflate the subsidiary's value before a planned sale. Standing among the mislabeled parts and duplicated signatures, she felt something shift inside her that no boardroom presentation had ever managed to reach, a recognition that the numbers she had trusted for years were never neutral at all. Every delayed repair represented a family living with unreliable heat through a Chicago winter, and every duplicated signature represented a technician too overworked to properly inspect the building he was responsible for. She asked Wade how long he had known the reports were being altered, and he admitted he had suspected it for nearly 2 years before finally refusing to sign off on something he could not defend to the people living above him. That refusal had cost him everything he had built, yet he told her plainly that he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Wade handed her the flash drive at last, but made his intentions unmistakably clear, telling her he was not giving it to her so she could keep her chair at the head of the table. He said he was giving it to her so the people living in these buildings would not have to pay the price for a conflict unfolding among the wealthy far above their heads. Page called soon after to report that Audrey had confirmed the data on the drive matched records that had mysteriously vanished from the company's internal systems. Audrey had also discovered that the fund preparing to purchase Carrington Metro properties was quietly controlled by Dorian's own brother, transforming what looked like a struggling cost-cutting program into a calculated scheme to transfer company assets into the Blackwell family's hands at a fraction of their true worth. This was no longer simply a failed efficiency initiative. It was a deliberate plan to strip value from the company Helena's family had built and hand it to people who had engineered the crisis from the inside. With the board vote now less than 40 minutes away and headquarters nearly 10 miles distant, Helena and Wade boarded another bus, still dressed in the same worn clothing that had marked her as invisible all day long. What remained of the original $20 had shrunk to a handful of loose coins after 2 separate fares, a detail that would matter enormously once they finally reached the building where everything would be decided. New security personnel at the entrance failed to recognize Helena at all, insisting instead that she was attempting to impersonate the chief executive since Dorian had already ordered her access badge, her accounts, and her communication privileges locked from every system in the building. Paige arrived just in time to confirm Helena's identity in front of the confused guards, and Audrey followed close behind carrying a preliminary audit report, thick enough to answer most of the questions still hanging in the air. Inside the boardroom, the vote was already underway, with Dorian describing Helena as an unstable leader who had vanished during a crisis of her own creation and staged what he called a reckless publicity stunt at the worst possible moment. He urged Lenora Whitcomb, the chair of the board, to sign a resolution suspending Helena's authority immediately, framing the request as an act of necessary stability rather than the coup it actually resembled. The door opened, and Helena walked in wearing the same worn coat and dusty shoes she had carried through every closed door of that long afternoon, with Wade standing quietly behind her. Several board members stared in open shock, while others barely masked their contempt at the sight of a chief executive who looked more like the people her policies had displaced than the polished figure they expected. Dorian shifted his strategy instantly, claiming Wade was a disgruntled former employee who had exploited Helena's disoriented state to plant fabricated accusations against the company. Marla Keene, summoned into the room moments later, backed him up, insisting Wade had once threatened the company using stolen internal documents, a claim delivered with practiced confidence. Dorian then turned to Helena and asked, almost mockingly, how much she had paid this man to manufacture such convenient allegations against the company he had loyally served for decades. Helena placed the last few coins from Wade's $20 onto the polished table without a word of hesitation, letting the small pile of change speak before she did. She told the room plainly that he had not taken a single cent from her. Instead, he had given her the very last money he had, expecting nothing at all in return. The room fell silent as she recounted the entire sequence of that day, from her own phone locking without explanation, to the security detail receiving falsified instructions, to Wade's appeal hearing closing before its scheduled time, to Marla's attempt to force him into signing away his right to speak about safety violations he had personally documented. She described how maintenance reports had been altered, how delayed repairs had been disguised as savings on paper, and how the company preparing to purchase Carrington Metro properties traced directly back to Dorian's own family. Audrey stepped forward with her preliminary findings, confirming that every file on Wade's flash drive matched data that had been deliberately erased from the company's internal servers. Paige added a communication log proving that the falsified instructions sent to the security team originated from an account inside Dorian's own office, a detail he immediately tried to dismiss as a technical error rather than deliberate sabotage. When he suggested once more that Wade might have fabricated the evidence entirely, Wade calmly placed an old mechanical component onto the table, its serial number matching a part officially recorded as replaced 6 months earlier. He told the board simply that numbers displayed on a screen could be edited by anyone with the right access, but the serial number stamped into metal could not be argued away so easily. Lenora called for an immediate halt to the vote and demanded an independent investigation before any further action moved forward on either the leadership question or the proposed sale. Dorian pushed back hard, urging the board to complete the transaction before public scrutiny intensified. and in his urgency he accidentally revealed a confidential deadline attached to the sale contract that no other board member had ever been told about. That single slip proved he possessed knowledge only someone who had personally orchestrated the entire transaction could have known, and the room's mood shifted decisively against him within moments. Board members who had said nothing throughout the entire meeting suddenly found their voices, asking pointed questions about timelines and signatures that Dorian could no longer answer smoothly. Lenora, who had spent years defending caution over sentiment, looked at the serial number sitting on the table and then at Dorian's face, and something in her expression hardened into a decision she would not walk back. She reminded the room that the Carrington name had survived for generations because it protected the people beneath it, not because it protected whoever happened to be sitting closest to the money at any given moment. Security was asked to escort Dorian from the building rather than merely from the meeting, and Marla was placed on immediate leave, pending her own review, her earlier confidence collapsing into silence as she gathered her belongings under the gaze of colleagues who no longer offered her the courtesy of looking away. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board had frozen the sale of the subsidiary entirely, suspended both Dorian and Marla pending the outcome of a full investigation, and restored Helena's authority as chief executive while that investigation continued. Once the room emptied, Helena offered to return the original $20 along with a considerably larger sum as a gesture of gratitude. But Wade accepted only the exact amount he had given her, nothing more. He told her that if she turned his kindness into some kind of transaction, she still had not fully understood the lesson the day was meant to teach her. Helena apologized for ever believing poverty was simply a matter of poor choices that better discipline could resolve on its own. Wade explained the difference plainly, saying that a person with money is allowed to make mistakes, while a person without it can lose everything just from missing a single bus. Helena offered to restore his previous position immediately, but he did not accept right away, insisting the problem extended far beyond his individual case alone. He laid out several conditions before agreeing to anything further, beginning with a full review of every termination connected to Project Clear Horizon, followed by a genuine appeals process handled by an independent department rather than one controlled by finance. He insisted that safety reports could never again be edited by financial staff seeking better numbers on a quarterly summary, that employees who raised concerns about wrongdoing must receive real protection rather than quiet retaliation, and that any delayed repairs affecting tenants had to be disclosed openly rather than buried inside internal spreadsheets. Finally, he asked that Helena meet personally with people who had been affected by these decisions, without cameras or publicity attached to the visits, a request she accepted without negotiation. The first such visit took place in a small apartment where an elderly tenant showed Helena a space heater she had been forced to buy herself, after her building's furnace went unrepaired for most of a winter, the cost of which had eaten into money she needed for medication. Helena said little during that visit, choosing instead to listen the way she had never quite learned to listen from behind a desk on the 41st floor. She began keeping a private notebook after that, filling it not with figures or projections but with names and small details, the kind of information that never survived translation into a quarterly report. Wade noticed the notebook during one of their later meetings and said nothing about it directly, though the faint approval in his expression told her more than any words could have. Audrey was placed in charge of the broader investigation, while Paige took responsibility for restoring records that had been quietly altered over many months. Wade was invited to join a new safety review board representing frontline workers, though he agreed only after going through a transparent selection process, rather than accepting the position as a personal favor handed down by the chief executive. Helena also spoke publicly about her own role in the crisis, refusing to place the entire blame on Dorian alone, acknowledging instead that the distance between leadership and ordinary employees had created the very conditions he exploited so easily. For the first time since that long afternoon began, Wade allowed himself to believe that Helena was not simply protecting her reputation, but genuinely willing to change the structure that had shielded her from consequences for so long. 6 months later, the investigation confirmed everything Wade's evidence had suggested from the very beginning, showing that Dorian had manipulated internal reports, pressured managers into unnecessary layoffs, and prepared to sell company assets to a fund controlled by his own family at well below their real value. Carrington Metropolitan Group canceled the sale entirely and launched a comprehensive repair program across every building the original reports had quietly neglected. More than 100 termination cases were reopened during the review, and many of those affected received formal apologies, restored records, or financial compensation for what they had lost. Wade became the company's new director of Frontline Safety Review, spending his days moving between buildings and speaking directly with technicians rather than sitting behind a desk in a polished corner office. Eli appeared briefly at his high school graduation later that spring, and Helena attended quietly, without a camera crew or an expensive gift trailing behind her. She handed Wade a plain envelope, and inside it he found a single $20 bill, along with a short note explaining that this exact money had once carried her home, though the man who gave it away had done far more by carrying her back to reality. Wade smiled and handed the bill right back to her, telling her to keep it somewhere inside a boardroom, in case she ever again forgot how deeply a single decision made at that table could reach into someone else's life. Helena eventually placed the bill inside a small glass frame hung quietly in the boardroom itself, with no name attached beneath it, only a short line reminding anyone who read it that before calling something a cost on a balance sheet, they might first consider whose dinner it once represented. New executives touring the building sometimes paused in front of the frame, unsure at first why a single worn bill deserved a place among portraits of the company's founders. Page eventually began telling the story to every new hire during orientation, not as a piece of corporate legend, but as a plain account of how quickly comfort can blind a person to the exact system keeping them comfortable. Audrey's final report became required reading for every department head, not because anyone demanded it, but because Helena insisted that understanding what had gone wrong mattered more than simply moving past it quietly. The company was smaller after the changes, its profit margins less impressive on paper, yet its buildings finally matched the promises printed on the billboards outside them. The story closes as Helena and Wade step off an ordinary bus together, nothing like the private cars that once carried her everywhere she needed to go. She asks if he would like to get coffee sometime, promising this time she intends to pay for it herself. Wade answers that he would agree to that, provided she never once refers to it as a field study. They laugh together, easy and unforced, the beginning of something built on genuine respect rather than power or obligation between them. Helena once pretended to be poor for a single day, believing that brief discomfort alone would prove she understood the struggles of people far removed from her own life. In the end, it was a man with only $20 to his name who taught her that some lessons can never be purchased, no matter how large the fortune behind them.
Uh-oh. Damn, bro. Oh my god. Oh. I have no health left. Damn. You just gotta believe. Immobilize him when you get up close to him. Yeah. We got it. It's possible.